Hey there, History 104 folks. We are doing our web extra today. And this web extra is about farmers. It's a piece of chapter 20, and it's about the farmers and the Populist Party. And just a short one here, but I think it will help a little bit with our understanding of the issues in the progressive movement, which is chapter 21, because the populist movement seemed to predict a little bit of the some of the issues that the progressives would be interested in, even though it was a very different group of people, the populists versus the progressives. And when you look at what was going on with farmers, they had a lot of problems in the time period that we're studying. They had a lot to deal with. The world was changing pretty dramatically due to broadening markets all around the world. And so farmers had a lot to deal with. They had not had to deal as much with bankers prior to this period of time. But now with equipment getting more expensive, expanding the amount of land that they were using, they were finding that it was important to them to be able to deal with bankers. Processors of their products were another middleman sort of group that they had to deal with. They had to deal with railroads now increasingly as they're shipping their goods further from their homes and to get them to various markets, both in the United States and around the world. They had to deal with grain elevator operators, another middleman that was storing their product sometimes for periods of time, and then world markets. They had to deal with the fact that there were markets all around the world that were up for their products, and that supply and demand issues were causing their prices of their products to change pretty regularly. So farmers had an attitude of self-reliance. This is in the nature of the American farmer. It goes all the way back to when Thomas Jefferson said that if God had a chosen people, it was the independent farmer. And they were used to that notion of independence, and it made it difficult for them to kind of band together and become politically active early on in this process as they're experiencing some of the challenges of economic life. But eventually they overcome some of those issues and begin to, in fact, organize themselves. Farmers also had some differences from each other from one region to another. Down in the South, more cotton; in the West, food products. Smaller plots of land in the Northeast when they were still farming up there. So you have these differences of needs and differences of ways of doing business that cause the farmers also to have some difficulty in organizing themselves and finding some common ground. The key problem, of course, that farmers faced was a long-term decline in the prices of their products. Okay, this was in part due to the fact that supply of farm goods had increased due to more land being used in America as America expanded westward, and better technology. Farmers were simply more productive, and as a reality was, they were overproducing in a sense for the markets that were available. And remember, basic principle of economics: when something is less scarce, it's less valuable. If farm products are less scarce, the price of those products goes down. Now, that's good for you and me when we go to the grocery store, but it's a problem for the farmers, and that's a problem that they were experiencing during this period of time. Transportation and communications technology brought farmers into a world market, and they couldn't easily control that. In previous times, when they had been dealing largely with local people, they had more influence over the marketplace. But now, as they were expanding into world markets, population changes, changes in productivity of farm products around the world, these were the kinds of things that influenced the prices of their products, the supply and demand for their products. And it was simply out of their control compared to what they had previously had in the local markets. So this was very difficult for farmers as they saw themselves losing control of the marketplaces that they dealt with and the prices that were being charged for their products. And in part because, not unlike a lot of Americans today, they didn't have a great grasp of the way the economy worked. The farmers began to see the middlemen that I was talking about earlier, railroads and processors, as the villains. These were the bad guys. They were deliberately robbing farmers of their money and of their income for their farm products. Now, in some cases, the farmers were right in that these individuals were really cheating them. But in some cases, they blame the railroads and the processors more than they deserved. They certainly resented the higher railroad rates that they paid, while, as we talked about previously, J.D. Rockefeller got rebates. He was able to, Rockefeller, that is, was able to really squeeze better prices out of the railroads. And farmers didn't have that kind of leverage, certainly when they were acting on their own. And that's one of the reasons they would start to band together to try to get some of that leverage. And so they resented that. They saw that that was going on. This is an example when the farmers were right about the railroads really cheating them and not treating them fairly. And so this was an area where they had a lot of concern. And they felt they had a very little bargaining power as individuals, and they didn't have much bargaining power as individuals. You compare them, again, to J.D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and the other big entrepreneurs of that era that were producing things and shipping things around the country. The farmers just didn't have any leverage to try to improve the prices that they had to pay. So this is the kind of motivation that they had for banding together and seeing if they could make some changes in that marketplace by working collectively. Another problem for the farmers were the high tariffs that were being utilized at the time to protect American industries. Remember, tariffs are taxes on goods coming into the country. And this is done to protect American industries and reduce competition for American industries with the overseas manufacturers. So the tariffs then cause prices to rise because, remember, competition tends to push prices down. When there's less competition, prices tend to go up. So if foreign goods can't get into the United States and there's less competition, prices will tend to rise. And therefore, farmers who are dependent upon manufacturers for all the kinds of goods that they use in their homes and that they use in the production of their products, whether that be tractors or anything else, they end up paying higher prices. And so farmers were hurt while the entrepreneurial class was benefiting from the tariffs that they were lobbying to get the Congress to pass and lobbying to get the president to support. So farmers felt that they were being hurt by the government as well in some ways that was passing these high tariffs. Farmers had started to have problems with debt. They borrowed for land. They borrowed for the technology they were using on the farm. Sometimes they had to borrow for various other kinds of supplies. Sometimes they had to borrow money just to buy the seeds to plant. All of these needs led them to borrow money, and the consequence of that was farmers started to experience debts in higher proportions to their income than they had previously had. And they were discontented by what was going on in regarding currency. They felt that money was too hard to get. They actually wanted inflation. They wanted generally rising prices. That's what inflation means. And one way to get inflation of prices is to have an increase in the money supply. Remember that things that are more scarce are more valuable. Things that are less scarce are less valuable. So if money becomes less scarce, if there's more money printed and available in the marketplace, then if money is less scarce, money is less valuable. If money is less valuable, it takes more money to buy the same amount of product that you had purchased previously. So if it used to cost $1, now it costs $1.50, for example, that's inflation. That's what farmers wanted. They wanted the prices to rise because it was going to benefit them in terms of their income, number one, because the product prices would be rising that they were selling. Corn, wheat, meat products, eggs, whatever it would be. If those prices are going up, it means more income to them. Also, remember that one of the benefits of inflation is to people who have debts. That when the value of money is going down, if you borrowed $100 from your friend and there's a lot of inflation, when you pay them back, $100 isn't worth what it used to be. So in a sense, your friend's getting less money back from you than they loaned you. That's why banks have to charge an interest rate that is higher than the rate of inflation. Otherwise, they're losing money when they get money back from the people they loaned the money to. So farmers wanted inflation because it had the effect of really lowering their debts. And that was something else that they were seeking. So farmers were discontented on that issue of inflation as well. The amount of paper money in the economy at this period of time did not change. And it was fixed. It was tied to the amount of gold that the United States had. And farmers wanted to break that connection between gold and paper money, and they wanted to change it over to silver, which was more plentiful. So farmers were pursuing inflation during this period of time, and they were trying to break away from the gold standard and move to increased printing of money and coining of silver currency. So when the farmers, this is the graph here that shows what the farmers were facing. And it's just one example of a product. It's wheat. You could put virtually any other product on this graph, and you would see similar sorts of trends, whether it be corn, whether it be cotton. The product prices were falling for farmers. And so if the dollars per barrel had been 8 in 1865, had gone as high as about 12 in 1875, but then begins this long fall. And when now farmers can only sell their barrel of wheat for about $3 a barrel, they're $9 a barrel behind where they were about 25 years earlier. So farmers are really suffering from the falling prices during this time, and that means falling incomes for them. So one of the things that they did is they began forming organizations to try to help themselves. And the first of the major organizations formed across the country was known as the Grange. Grange is simply an old word for farming. It was formed in the 1870s, started in the Great Plains in the South, and began to spread across the country and formed local Grange units that were associated with the larger national Grange. You still sometimes here in Michigan and other places in the Midwest, if you're driving around in small towns, you will sometimes still see Grange buildings. And there are still some Grange organizations, although of course they're much, much smaller and less robust than they were earlier on, and they're more social organizations today. And they filled that role a little bit for the people then. But in terms of what we're studying here, in terms of politics, they were blaming railroads, banks, other middlemen for their problems and their product prices, and they were organizing themselves to try to deal with that a little bit. So they thought these railroads and others were what they called thieves in the night. So they began pushing through various, in their local areas and in states, various kinds of laws to regulate shipping rates and to help deal with other farm costs. These are typically referred to as Granger laws. And these laws were typically overturned in the courts, so they didn't tend to stay in effect very long. But the Grangers did have some positive impact on the political system for their constituency, the people they represented, the farmers, by getting these shipping rate laws passed to try to regulate how much the railroads could charge farmers. And like I said, the laws were typically overturned and ruled unconstitutional. And so eventually the farmers went back to the difficult spot they had been in. They also began to set up some cooperatives. This is when they came together to form, essentially businesses where they worked with and for each other, such as grain elevators. So rather than pay someone else to store their grain for some period of time, they would store their own grain in a location that they were paying for as a group. This was to help regulate their costs a little bit and drive them down. They also set up some retail stores for farm machinery. But when there was a depression that hit by the late 1870s, it really wiped out most of these efforts. They just couldn't afford to do it anymore. So an economic downturn in this way really, really hurt the Grangers and what they were trying to do. They advocated programs such as cooperative purchasing ventures, like I was just mentioning, as a way to obtain lower prices on farm equipment and supplies. They also were trying to pool their savings together to see if they could work around the banks. It's an early form of what we today would think of as a credit union, where they were joining together and they all kind of owned the bank institution together rather than depending upon someone else. So these cooperative ventures were things that the Grangers did. to try to improve the situation for themselves and to take some control over it. They also tried to create these cooperative grain elevators that I mentioned, and they were trying to hold these non-perishable crops, if they could, something that could be stored for a long period of time until the price was right to sell it. And they also tried to create some farm equipment, manufacture some farm equipment. This venture didn't really work out very well. And in fact, it's one of the reasons the Grangers began to decline, is they lost a lot of money trying to make farm equipment. This is a work of art that shows, that sort of the ideal of the Granger. This yeoman farmer. You see here sort of a proud figure in the middle of the graphic, and you see around the outside, other visions, sort of idealistic visions of what the farmer represented into American culture. And you see some element of trying to represent both North with this tree here, and then the South represented by this palm-like tree here. Another graphic, I think, also shows how the farmer was trying to portray himself as really central in America, quite literally. If you look around the outside of this graphic, you'll see that it says, the soldier, I fight for all; the preacher, I preach for all; the sailor, I sail for all; the market individual, this grocer, I buy and sell for all. But for all of these people, the farmer says, I feed you all, trying to really make the case of the centrality of the farmer in American life and the need to take care of the farmer through the American political system, and not just take care of the entrepreneurial class or the railroad industry or the people who seem to have a lot of leverage at the time. Another organization that formed after the Grangers was the Farmers Alliance. This was also another agency, kind of like the Grangers, for farmers, to try to advocate for them politically, and also to try to create some cooperatives for them. It was a little bit more divided regionally, but it did have some powerful impact, and they continued to call for some of the very same kinds of issues that the Grangers had called for, especially, again, increasing the money supply to cause greater inflation. They wanted increased coinage of silver because that would have caused prices to rise, which would have benefited them, and also would have that impact, as I said earlier, of reducing their debts. Out of all of this came a political party, and it became known as the People's Party, or the Populist Party. And they began to form this party in the 1890s, and it was really a conglomeration of farmers, but also some working class people in America. And they were pulling themselves together to see if they could get into politics in a more direct way, not just convince the Republicans, the Democrats to pass legislation that would benefit them, but actually have their own members in the legislatures at the state level, even the national level, to try and influence the legislative process and to get laws that were more favorable to their needs. So this political party, the People's Party, they had a platform, and amongst the things that it called for were the government ownership of railroads, banks, and the telegraph, with the main communication mechanism of the day. So they wanted the government to actually take over these key industries, and that's a pretty radical proposal for that period of time, or it would be for today as well. It's one thing to ask for government regulation. It's another thing entirely for it to ask for the government to take over those industries. But that's how strongly they felt that the middleman of the railroads, the banks, and some others they thought were taking advantage of them. They called for an 8-hour day for working people. They wanted it reduced. The working class folks of that era, often 12 hours a day. If they were fortunate, 10 hours a day. So 8 hours a day would have been a real improvement for the working class individual of that time. They called for a graduated income tax. This also sometimes is known as a progressive income tax, where at higher levels of income, you pay a higher percentage of taxation. And then you have the revenue to fund various kinds of government programs that you're generating through the tax. And if people on the lower end are going to benefit from some of those programs, but they're actually going to pay less money into the governmental system. And we have some level of this today, of course, where you hear about tax brackets, and at higher incomes you pay a higher percentage of your income in federal income tax. They wanted a sub-treasury system. This was a system designed to keep their product off the market until the price was better, and also it was a system where they could make up the difference between low prices and what it costs to them. It's a rather complicated proposal, this whole sub-treasury system, but it was the idea behind it was to help farmers get better prices for their products in the marketplace, to cover up some of the difference between their costs and the price that they were able to get out there in the product rate market for their products. And then they fought for various kinds of political reforms. These reforms were typically reforms that increased the level of democratic participation. I mean that small d, not big D party Democrat, but democratic participation of the people. So just one example of this would be the direct election of senators. The senators had been, under the Constitution, chosen by the state legislatures, and the Populists called for a change in that system so that people could elect the senators directly, rather than have that election be indirect, with the state legislatures choosing who the senators would be. They also favored some other democratic reforms like referendums to let people vote on various kinds of laws, recall, to have the people vote on removing someone from office if they don't feel that someone's doing a good job for their area at the time. Recall a governor, for example, that they feel is doing poor work as governor. So these were the kinds of reforms that they were calling for. We will see some of these reform issues picked up by the progressives in Chapter 21. In particular, many of the political reforms, and some of the reforms that would have helped out working class individuals. They ran people for various kinds of elections. They lost the 1892 presidential race, but they did elect governors, members of Congress, senators, and then, of course, they had a lot of impact on their state legislatures as well. So they had both national and local impact as a political party in trying to produce change by getting a new kind of individual into the government. This political cartoon here refers to the People's Party as having a platform of lunacy. This hot air balloon that's stitched together of a bunch of different fabrics here. And you can see it says Knights of Labor, the Old Granger Party, Socialists, the Silver Party, Prohibition people. So all of these individuals are kind of trying to stitch something together, according to this cartoonist, and it's kind of a crazy idea from this cartoonist's perspective. But this next cartoon here shows how a more favorable view of the party and what they were trying to achieve. And they said that by the government, by the rejection of the coinage of silver, they'd been stabbed in the back in 1873, and that they and the labor were being saddled with debt. You can see that's what's on this man's back. The road to pauperism, being a pauper, of course, is being somebody who's extremely poor and dependent upon others for assistance. You can see the building behind him says mortgaged, that he owes on the home and the land, and that he is tied down to this ball and chain of interest that he owes the banks. So this is a more favorable view of the populist ideal. So the Populist Party and the problems of farmers that led to the Populist Party is just one element of Chapter 20 that is worth taking a look at. And like I said, it does relate relatively directly to what we will be studying in Chapter 21. about the progressives, another group of people that was very much interested in reform. So that's the end of our web extra here for today, and thank you for watching.